They gave my mother 7 days to leave the home she had lived in for more than 3 decades. Not because she committed a crime, not because she refused to pay her bills, because her roses were a few inches too tall. 93 years old, 31 years in that house. That porch was where she used to sit with my father in the evenings, watching the sunset over the street. That kitchen was where she taught me how to make pancakes when I was 10. And that garden in the front yard, the one with the roses, was something my parents built together one summer long before my father passed away. And yet somehow, according to the Homeowners Association, those roses had become a violation serious enough to force her out. The notice wasn't even delivered in person. It was slipped under the door. No knock, no conversation, just a cold legal document. 7 days to vacate. Signed by the HOA president, a woman named Beverly Trout. My mother called me that night. What struck me wasn't that she sounded upset. It was the opposite. Her voice was calm, controlled, too calm. When someone reaches 93 years old, they've learned how to carry worry quietly. And that quiet hit me harder than anything she could have said. I was 4 hours away when the call came in. By the time she finished explaining what happened, I had already grabbed my keys. Let me tell you something about me so the rest of this story makes sense. My name is Garrett Wolfson. I spent 12 years serving in the Navy's Special Operations community, 2 combat deployments, a few training assignments overseas, the kind of work where patience isn't optional, it's survival. When you've spent enough time waiting in the dark for the right moment to act, you develop a habit. You observe first, you move later. After leaving the military, I came back home to North Carolina, to a community called Mill Haven Crossing. It's the kind of place where Saturday mornings smell like fresh grass and charcoal grills. Kids ride bikes down quiet streets. People wave when they pass each other on evening walks. At least that's how it used to be. My mother, Dolores Wolfson, had lived there since 1993. She knew everyone, every neighbor, every dog, every birthday. The woman practically ran the social life of that street without ever trying to. Her house wasn't fancy. 3 bedrooms, old hardwood floors, a small porch with 2 rocking chairs. But the front yard, that was her pride. Hydrangeas along the walkway, a small stone path my parents built together years ago, and those roses along the fence line. Beautiful, bright red roses that had grown there for over 20 years. The little wooden sign near the mailbox read, Wolfson Place. My mother painted it herself back in the 90s. That sign had survived hurricanes, storms, and 30 years of neighborhood changes, but apparently it couldn't survive Beverly Trout. Now Beverly was the HOA president, mid-50s, always dressed like she was attending a business luncheon, cream-colored blazers, perfect hair, and a white Cadillac SUV with a custom license plate that spelled out her name. She had been HOA president for 3 years. Mostly because nobody else wanted the job. At first, people thought she was just enthusiastic. Then the notices started. Small things, petty things, a garden hose left out overnight, holiday decorations taken down 2 days too late, leaves sitting in gutters during autumn. Normal things that happen in a neighborhood full of trees, but Beverly treated them like serious offenses. My mother received warning letters, then small fines. She paid them without complaint. Some people just like rules, she told me once over the phone. But the situation slowly escalated. Then came the roses. The HOA rulebook stated that decorative plants along fences could not exceed 48 inches in height. My mother's roses had grown slightly above that, 52 inches at the tallest spot. 4 inches, about the height of a soda can. Most HOA boards would send a courtesy notice, maybe ask the homeowner to trim them. That's not what Beverly did. She skipped straight to enforcement. Because my mother had previous notices on file, those minor ones about hoses and wreaths, Beverly classified her as a repeat violator. That allowed the HOA to take extreme action under the HOA's enforcement rules, which led to the letter now sitting on my mother's kitchen table. 7 days to vacate. A 93-year-old woman forced out of her home over roses. I pulled into the driveway at 2:14 in the morning. The neighborhood was silent, sprinklers ticking somewhere in the distance. The porch light was on. My mother always left it on when she knew I was coming. Inside, she already had coffee ready. At 2 in the morning, she was wearing her robe, glasses pushed up on her forehead, trying to act normal, trying not to worry me. "Don't do anything dramatic," she said while sliding a mug across the table. I told her I just wanted to read the paperwork. The eviction notice was 3 pages, legal language, references to HOA covenants and enforcement policies. At first glance, it looked official, but years of military planning had taught me something important. Every document has a weak point. You just have to find it. So I read slowly, line by line. Then I noticed something interesting. The notice listed 3 prior violations used to justify the eviction, but 2 of them had already been resolved. The fines had been paid, which meant those violations shouldn't count anymore. That was the first red flag. Then I found the second one. According to the HOA bylaws, a decision as serious as removing someone from their home required a formal board vote. 5 board members had to approve it, but the notice was signed by only one person, Beverly Trout. No meeting record, no vote documentation, just her signature. Which meant one of 2 things had happened. Either the board voted and failed to document it, or Beverly acted on her own. Neither scenario looked good for her. At 7 a.m. that morning, I called the HOA management company. I asked for the meeting minutes where the board voted to remove my mother from her home. Then I drove to the county courthouse to pull public records because HOA documents are public filings. Anyone can access them. 2 hours later, I had what I needed. There was no board vote, no meeting, no approval. The eviction notice had been filed entirely by Beverly Trout, which meant she might have just broken the HOA's own rules. And if she broke those rules, the entire case against my mother could collapse. But that wasn't the only thing I discovered that day. Not even close. Because when I started digging into the HOA's financial records, I found something much bigger. Something that made the roses look like a distraction. And by the time Beverly realized what I had uncovered, it was already too late. What started as a fight over a few inches of roses was about to turn into something far bigger. Because buried inside the HOA's financial records was a $380,000 payment, and the name attached to the company that received it was Beverly Trout. When people abuse small amounts of power, they usually make one mistake. They assume nobody will look closely. Beverly Trout had clearly made that assumption, because the moment I started reviewing the HOA's financial records, something jumped out immediately. Millhaven Crossing collected a lot of money every year: homeowner dues, violation fines, maintenance fees. According to the annual financial disclosure filed with the county, the HOA had collected about $847,000 the previous year alone. For a neighborhood of that size, that wasn't unusual. What was unusual was where the money wasn't. HOAs are supposed to keep something called a reserve fund. That's the account used for major repairs, road resurfacing, pool renovations, storm damage, things like that. For a community the size of Millhaven Crossing, the reserve fund should have been comfortably over 6 figures. Instead, it contained just $42,000. I stared at that number for a long moment. $42,000. That wasn't just low, that was dangerously low. Meaning either the HOA had recently spent a huge amount of money or someone had been very creative with the accounting. I drove back to my mother's house with copies of the records. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, organizing paperwork like she always did. "Find anything interesting?" she asked. I set the documents down in front of her. "Mom," I said carefully, "did the neighborhood do any major construction projects recently?" She thought for a moment. Then she snapped her fingers. "Oh, the pool." "The pool?" I asked. "Yes," she said. 2 summers ago. Beverly said the community pool needed to be resurfaced." "How much did it cost?" My mother shrugged. "I remember hearing something like $300,000. I felt my stomach tighten. $300,000. That was a massive number for pool resurfacing. Even high-end commercial pool renovations usually cost a fraction of that. But I didn't say anything yet. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called someone I trusted, a former Army buddy of mine named Thatcher Cole. After leaving the service, Thatcher had gone to law school and built a career in real estate and contract law. If there was something shady in those documents, he'd see it. He answered on the second ring. "Garrett, long time." "Yeah, I wish this was a social call." I explained the situation, the eviction notice, the roses, the missing board vote, and then the pool contract. There was a short pause on the line while Thatcher reviewed the documents I'd just emailed him. Then he exhaled slowly. "Okay," he said. "Good interesting or bad interesting? Potentially criminal interesting." He explained something important. Pool resurfacing for a residential community normally costs between $20,000 and $60,000, depending on size and materials. Even if you included deck repairs and tile replacement, the cost rarely exceeded $100,000. But the invoice I had in front of me was for $380,000, more than triple the high end. "Who was the contractor?" Thatcher asked. I flipped through the paperwork. "Company called Pristine Aquatic Solutions, LLC. Another pause. "Never heard of them. Let me check something." I heard his keyboard clicking in the background. A moment later, he spoke again. "Well, that's fascinating. What? The company was registered 2 years ago. That lines up with the pool renovation." "Yes," Thatcher said slowly. "But there's only one listed employee." I waited. "And the registered agent," he stopped typing, "is Beverly Trout." The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that the HOA president approved a $380,000 contract to a company she controls?" Thatcher finished. "Yes." I sat back in the chair. "Well," I said, "that's not ideal." Thatcher actually laughed. "Garrett," he said, "that's not just not ideal, that's potentially fraud." But he wasn't done. "Before we go throwing around that word," he continued, "we need more documentation." "What kind? Permits, construction records, county filings?" Which meant another trip. The next morning, I went to the county assessor's office. Construction projects over a certain value require a building permit. That permit includes something extremely useful: the declared value of the project. I requested the permit records for the Millhaven Crossing pool renovation. The clerk printed them out. I thanked her and walked to a nearby bench. Then I looked down at the number listed under project value. $31,000. $31,000. The HOA had paid $380,000 for work officially permitted as $31,500. Even allowing for extra work outside the permit scope, the gap was enormous. It wasn't a discrepancy, it was a canyon. I drove straight back to my mother's house. Thatcher arrived later that afternoon. We spread everything out across the kitchen table: the eviction notice, the HOA bylaws, the financial disclosure, the contractor registration, the building permit. My mother brought us egg salad sandwiches, because that's what she does when something serious is happening. She feeds people. Thatcher leaned back in his chair after reviewing everything. "Well," he said finally, "the roses were never the real issue." "No," I agreed, "they weren't." He tapped the pool contract with his pen. "If this becomes public," he said, "that HOA board is going to have a serious problem." "What about Beverly?" Thatcher looked at me. "If she directed HOA funds into a company she controls—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. But there was something else bothering me. Why go after my mother? Why start this fight? Thatcher thought about it. "Simple," he said. "People abusing power usually pick targets they think won't fight back. A 93-year-old widow with roses in her yard probably seemed like a safe target. But Beverly had miscalculated, because the moment she slipped that notice under my mother's door, she didn't just start an HOA enforcement case, she started a war she didn't know she was fighting. And I wasn't done digging, because financial records were only the beginning. The real story was about to come from somewhere else entirely: the neighbors. And once they started talking, Beverly Trout's entire system of control began to fall apart. Within 2 days, I had knocked on 12 doors in the neighborhood, and what those neighbors showed me proved one thing: my mother wasn't Beverly Trout's first target, not even close. And when the rest of the neighborhood realized that, everything changed. By the third day, I had knocked on 12 doors in the neighborhood. At first, I expected polite sympathy, maybe a few people saying they were sorry about my mother's situation. What I didn't expect was how quickly people started telling their own stories. The first person was a retired teacher named Mrs. Caldwell, who lived 2 houses down. She opened the door slowly, squinting at me through the screen. When I introduced myself as Dolores Wolfson's son, her expression softened immediately. "Oh, honey," she said, shaking her head, "your poor mother." I asked if she had ever had issues with the HOA. Mrs. Caldwell disappeared into the hallway and came back carrying a small cardboard box. She set it on the porch railing and lifted the lid. Inside were envelopes, dozens of them, all stamped with the same return address, Mill Haven Crossing Homeowners Association. "Those are from the last 2 years," she said quietly. I picked one up. The violation notice inside cited her for improper mailbox decoration. The offense? A small seasonal ribbon tied around the post. Fine amount? $75. Another envelope listed a violation for excessive bird feeders. Fine amount? $120. Mrs. Caldwell leaned against the doorframe. "I'm 78 years old," she said. "I like watching birds in the morning." I nodded slowly. "How many of these did you receive?" She gave a tired smile. "Enough that I stopped opening them." That was door number 1. Door number 2 belonged to a couple named Frank and Lydia Harper. Frank used to run a construction company before retiring. When I mentioned Beverly Trout, he actually laughed. Not the happy kind of laugh, the kind people make when something has annoyed them for a long time. "Let me guess," he said. "She finally went after Dolores?" I told him about the eviction notice. Frank disappeared into his garage and came back with a folder. Inside were photographs, pictures of his driveway taken from the street. "They fined me $200 for parking my work truck here overnight," he said. The photo showed a completely normal pickup truck, clean, parked properly, not blocking anything. "What was the violation?" I asked. "Commercial vehicle restriction." I looked around. Across the street, another pickup truck sat in someone else's driveway. Same size, same type. "Did they find that house too?" I asked. Frank snorted. "Nope." "Why not?" "Because that's Beverly's friend." I wrote that down. Then came door number 3, door number 4, door number 5. By the time I reached the 12th house, a pattern had started to form, and it wasn't subtle. Beverly Trout didn't enforce the HOA rules equally. She enforced them selectively. If she liked you, nothing happened. If she didn't, suddenly every tiny detail of your property became a violation. One neighbor had been fined for leaving garbage cans visible 6 hours too long after pickup. Another received a warning because their holiday lights were too bright. Someone else was cited because their lawn furniture didn't match the approved color palette. The more I listened, the more obvious it became. The rules themselves weren't the real problem. The problem was how they were being used. Rules can protect a neighborhood, but in the wrong hands, they become weapons. That evening, I returned to my mother's house with a notebook full of stories. She was sitting on the porch trimming one of her rose bushes. "I hope you're not planning anything reckless," she said without looking up. "Just gathering information," I replied. She pointed the clippers toward the street. "You know Beverly drives past here 3 times a day now." I raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Oh yes," she said calmly, "very slowly." That told me something important. Beverly knew this situation was escalating, and that meant she was watching. But the biggest discovery came from a man named Luis Martinez. Luis lived at the end of the block and worked as an electrician. When I knocked on his door, he invited me inside immediately. "I've been waiting for someone to push back," he said. He pulled a thick binder from a cabinet and dropped it on the kitchen table. "Start with page 1. Inside were copies of HOA financial reports, invoices, contractor bids, maintenance records, all carefully organized." "Where did you get this?" I asked. "I used to volunteer on the HOA maintenance committee before Beverly took over." He flipped to one page in particular. "This is the landscaping contract. The number listed at the top was $145,000 per year.
"That seems high," I said. Luis nodded. "It should be about half that." "Who's the contractor?" "Greenway Property Services." I wrote the name down. Luis leaned forward slightly. "Want to hear something interesting?" "Always." "The company address is a P.O. box." "So?" "That P.O. box is registered to Beverly Trout's brother." I stared at the document. "So the HOA is paying a landscaping company that belongs to her family," Luis finished. "Exactly." And suddenly the pool contract didn't look like an isolated incident anymore. It looked like a pattern. HOA money flowing into companies connected to Beverly, overpriced contracts, selective enforcement, and residents too intimidated or exhausted to challenge it. Because HOA disputes can get ugly, lawyers, fines, liens on property. Most people just pay and move on with their lives. But Beverly had made one mistake. She had gone after someone the entire neighborhood loved. My mother. And that changed the equation. Luis tapped the binder again. "You're not the first person to notice this," he said. "But you might be the first person willing to fight it." I closed the binder. "How many people in the neighborhood would show up if there was a meeting about this?" Luis smiled. "More than Beverly expects." Which gave me an idea. Because HOAs operate on something very simple: votes. And according to the bylaws, any group of homeowners could demand a special community meeting if they collected enough signatures. I checked the rule. 30 households. That was the number required. Millhaven Crossing had more than 100 homes. 30 signatures was completely achievable. But if we were going to do this, we had to do it carefully. Because once Beverly realized what we were planning, she would fight back. And something told me she wasn't used to losing. By the end of that evening, we already had 22 signatures. 8 more and we could legally force a community meeting. But what Beverly didn't know yet was that someone inside the HOA just called me. And what they told me about the pool contract was even worse than I thought.
The call came at 9:17 that night. I was sitting at my mother's kitchen table going through the HOA bylaws again when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something told me to answer. "Garrett Wolfson?" a quiet voice asked. "Yes?" There was a pause on the other end. "I can't talk long," the caller said, "and I need you to understand something first." "What's that?" "If Beverly finds out I called you, I'll lose my position on the HOA board." That got my attention immediately. "Who is this?" I asked. "My name is Daniel Prescott," the voice said. "I'm one of the 5 board members." I leaned back in the chair. The same board that was supposed to approve eviction decisions. The same board that, according to the paperwork, had never voted on my mother's case. "Why are you calling me?" I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Because what's happening to your mother isn't right." He explained that Beverly had taken control of the HOA gradually over the past few years. At first, she simply handled paperwork. Then she started running meetings. Then, slowly, the other board members stopped questioning her decisions. She always had documents ready, charts, numbers, legal language. Most of the board members weren't experts in HOA law. They trusted her. But things changed after the pool renovation. That project was supposed to cost around $40,000, Daniel said. My eyes narrowed. "That's close to what the county permit says." "Yes," he replied. But Beverly presented a completely different contract at the meeting. How different? $380,000, the exact number from the financial records. "Did the board approve it?" I asked. "That's the problem," Daniel said. "There was never a formal vote." I sat up straight. "Then how did it get approved?" "Beverly told us the contractor needed a fast decision to lock in materials. She said if we delayed, the cost would go up." "And the board believed her?" "Most of them did." Daniel hesitated before continuing. "But a few months later, I asked to review the contract again. And she told me it had already been archived with the management company. Meaning he couldn't see it, meaning she controlled the paper trail." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because the eviction notice against your mother wasn't approved either." I already suspected that, but hearing it confirmed from a board member was something else entirely. Daniel lowered his voice. "Garrett, Beverly is starting to panic." "Why?" "She knows people are talking." "Of course she did. Small neighborhoods don't keep secrets well." "And there's something else," Daniel added. "What?" "She scheduled an emergency enforcement review for tomorrow morning." "What does that mean?" "It means she's planning to escalate the violations against your mother." My stomach tightened. "Escalate? How?" "She wants to place a property lien on the house." "A lien? That would allow the HOA to legally claim money from the property if it were sold. It was a pressure tactic, a very aggressive one." "Can she do that without the board?" I asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. "Technically, no. But she might try anyway." I thanked him for the call. Before hanging up, Daniel said one more thing. "If you're planning to challenge her, do it fast." Then the line went dead. The next morning confirmed exactly what Daniel warned about. At 8:30, a white envelope appeared in my mother's mailbox. HOA letterhead. Inside was another violation notice. This one cited landscape obstruction exceeding height restrictions. The roses, again, but this time the fine wasn't $75, it was $600, and if unpaid within 5 days, the HOA would begin lien proceedings against the property. My mother read the notice slowly. Then she folded it neatly and placed it on the table. "Well," she said calmly, "that seems unnecessary." I couldn't help smiling. 93 years old, facing an aggressive legal threat, and she still described it as unnecessary. "Don't worry about this," I told her. "Something is already in motion." Because by that point, the petition was almost finished. 22 signatures the night before. By noon, we had 29. We only needed one more. Luis Martinez drove with me to the last house on the list, a quiet brick home owned by Mrs. Evelyn Porter, a widow who had lived in the neighborhood nearly as long as my mother. She answered the door slowly, leaning on a cane. Luis explained the situation, the petition, the meeting request. Mrs. Porter listened carefully. Then she nodded. "I wondered when someone would finally do this," she said. She took the clipboard, signed her name, and handed it back. 30 signatures. Exactly the number required under the HOA bylaws, which meant something very important. The homeowners of Mill Haven Crossing could now legally demand a special community meeting, and the board had no choice but to hold it. Luis grinned as we walked back to the truck. "You realize what this means, right?" "Oh, I do. Because HOA meetings operate under specific rules. Residents can ask questions, they can demand explanations, and if enough homeowners agree, they can even vote to remove board members from power." Which meant Beverly Trout was about to face something she hadn't faced in years: accountability. We submitted the petition to the HOA management office that afternoon. They were legally required to respond within 48 hours, and they did. The email arrived the next morning. Subject line: Special Community Meeting Notice. Date: Friday evening. Location: Mill Haven Crossing Clubhouse. Attendance requested: all residents. Luis called me the moment he saw it. "Garrett," he laughed, "she can't stop it now." But there was one problem, something Beverly had done right before the announcement went out. Something that made this entire situation even more dangerous. Because later that afternoon, another letter arrived at my mother's house. This one wasn't from the HOA, it was from a law firm, and the message inside was very clear. If the accusations against Beverly were mentioned publicly at the community meeting, the homeowners involved would face defamation lawsuits. Which meant Beverly wasn't just preparing for the meeting, she was preparing for war. The community meeting was now 3 days away. 30 homeowners were ready to confront Beverly Trout, but the legal threat she just sent out was designed to scare everyone into silence. And for a moment, it almost worked, until one person in the neighborhood stood up and said something that changed everything. "You all deserve to see the pool contract."
And once that document hit the table, there was no turning back.
By Friday evening, the Millhaven Crossing clubhouse parking lot was already full. I had never seen that building this crowded before. Normally, HOA meetings attracted maybe 10 people, 15 if there was a controversial topic on the agenda. Tonight, there were more than 70 residents standing outside the doors. Some leaned against cars, talking quietly. Others held printed copies of the meeting notice. The atmosphere wasn't angry. It was something else. Curiosity. People wanted answers. Luis Martinez stood beside me near the entrance. "Beverly's going to lose her mind when she sees this," he muttered. Inside the clubhouse, rows of folding chairs had been arranged, facing a long table at the front of the room. 5 chairs behind the table, the HOA board. At exactly 7 p.m., the doors opened. Residents slowly filled the room. Within minutes, every chair was taken. More people stood along the walls. Then, Beverly Trout walked in. She looked exactly the same as always. Cream-colored blazer, perfect hair, confident posture, but there was something slightly different tonight. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She sat down at the center of the table and adjusted the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," she said smoothly. "Thank you for attending this special meeting of the Millhaven Crossing Homeowners Association." Her tone was calm, professional, like nothing unusual was happening. But when she glanced across the crowd, her eyes paused briefly on me. She knew exactly why I was there. The other board members took their seats beside her. One of them was Daniel Prescott. He avoided looking directly at Beverly. Beverly cleared her throat and continued. "Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that accusations and defamatory statements against board members or residents will not be tolerated." A subtle warning, the same threat that had appeared in the lawyer's letter. Several people shifted in their seats. For a moment, the room was quiet. Then Beverly moved to the first agenda item, community landscaping updates. No one spoke. "Next item," she said quickly, "budget planning for next quarter." Still silence. Everyone knew why they were there. Finally, someone near the back of the room raised a hand. It was Luis. "Yes?" Beverly said stiffly. Luis stood up slowly. "I'd like to ask about the eviction notice issued to Dolores Wolfson." The room immediately became very still. Beverly's smile tightened. "That matter is currently under enforcement review," she replied. "It is not appropriate for discussion during this meeting." Luis didn't sit down. "With respect," he said, "the eviction notice affects the entire community." Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Beverly tapped the microphone lightly. "The HOA has procedures for these matters." Then another voice spoke up, Mrs. Caldwell, the retired teacher. "She's 93 years old," she said from the second row. More murmurs. Beverly's expression hardened slightly. "The HOA rules apply equally to all residents." That's when I stood up. "I'd like to see the vote record," I said. Beverly looked directly at me. "The vote record?" "Yes," I replied calmly, "the vote authorizing the eviction." For a moment she said nothing. Then she folded her hands on the table. "The board's internal discussions are not subject to public review." That answer immediately triggered whispers across the room, because several residents knew the bylaws. HOA board votes were absolutely supposed to be recorded. Daniel Prescott shifted in his seat. Then, very quietly, he reached for the microphone in front of him. "Actually," he said. Beverly turned toward him sharply. "Daniel?" Daniel swallowed. "There was no board vote." The room erupted. Voices, questions, people talking over each other. Beverly slammed her hand on the table. "Order!" she snapped, but it was too late. The silence she had controlled for years was gone. Someone near the back shouted, "Then how did the eviction happen?" Daniel hesitated. Then he said the words Beverly clearly didn't want spoken. "It was issued by the HOA president." Every eye in the room turned toward Beverly. Her expression changed instantly. The polished confidence cracked just slightly. She said, "That is a mischaracterization," she said sharply. Then I stepped forward. "Maybe, but that's not the only thing we need to discuss." Luis handed me a folder. Inside were copies of the documents we had gathered. I walked to the front of the room. The residents leaned forward in their chairs. 2 years ago," I said, "the HOA approved a pool renovation project." Beverly crossed her arms. "That project was necessary maintenance." "Yes," I agreed, "and according to county permits, the declared project value was $31,000. Several people exchanged confused looks. I lifted the next document. but the HOA financial report shows a payment of $380,000. The room exploded with noise again. What? 380? That can't be right. Beverly grabbed the microphone. "This is exactly the kind of misinformation I warned about," she said angrily, but I wasn't finished. I held up the contractor registration. The company that received the payment was Pristine Aquatic Solutions, LLC. Then I looked directly at Beverly. "And according to state business records, that company is registered to you." For a moment, the entire room went silent. Total silence. Then the reaction started. Gasps, whispers. Someone muttered, "No way!" Daniel Prescott looked down at the table. Beverly's face had gone pale. "That is a ridiculous accusation," she said, but her voice wasn't steady anymore. Luis stood up again. "Then maybe you'd like to explain the landscaping contract too." He held up another document. "Greenway Property Services." He paused. "Owned by your brother." Now the room wasn't just murmuring. People were angry, realizing what they had been paying for, realizing where the HOA money might have gone. Beverly stood up suddenly. "This meeting is over," she announced, but a voice from the back shouted something that stopped her. "You don't get to end it." More voices joined. "Answer the questions. Where did the money go? Show the contracts." Beverly looked around the room. For the first time since walking in, she looked genuinely afraid. Because the people she had controlled with warnings and fines were no longer afraid of her, and once that fear disappeared, so did her authority. But the biggest shock of the night was still coming, because just as the room reached its loudest point, the clubhouse doors opened, and two people walked in. One was a county investigator, the other was a police officer. The entire room went silent when the officer stepped forward and said Beverly Trout's name, because someone in the neighborhood had already reported the financial documents earlier that week, and now the county wanted answers right there in front of everyone. When the clubhouse doors opened and the police officer stepped inside, the room went completely silent. Just seconds earlier, 70 residents had been talking over each other. Now you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. The officer walked calmly toward the front of the room, accompanied by a man wearing a county badge clipped to his jacket. The badge read, "County Financial Oversight Division." The investigator looked around the crowded room, then down at a folder in his hand. "Is Beverly Trout present?" he asked. Beverly was still standing behind the board table. Her confident posture from earlier had completely disappeared. "Yes," she said slowly. The investigator nodded. "We received a report earlier this week regarding potential financial irregularities involving the Mill Haven Crossing Homeowners Association." No one in the room moved. Residents were frozen in place, watching what was happening. The investigator continued, "Specifically regarding the pool renovation project and several vendor contracts." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The officers stepped slightly forward beside him. "This isn't an arrest," the investigator clarified, "but we do need to ask some questions and review certain financial records." Beverly opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out at first. Finally, she said, "This is completely inappropriate. These accusations are based on misinformation." The investigator didn't argue. He simply held up a document. "Are you the registered agent for Pristine Aquatic Solutions, LLC?" The question hung in the air. Beverly hesitated, and that hesitation told the entire room everything it needed to know. "Yes," she finally said. Another wave of whispers moved through the crowd. The investigator flipped to another page. "And did that company receive a payment of $380,000 from the Mill Haven Crossing HOA?" Beverly straightened slightly. "That was a legitimate contract agreement," she replied. The investigator nodded again. "Then we'll need to review the contract documents and project invoices." He turned to the other board members. "Does the HOA maintain copies of those records here?" Daniel Prescott slowly raised his hand. "They're kept in the management office." "Thank you," the investigator said. The police officer then stepped forward just enough to make something very clear. "Until those records are reviewed," he said calmly, "we recommend that no further financial decisions be made by the current board." That statement landed like a hammer, because everyone in the room understood what it meant. Beverly Trout's authority was effectively frozen. The investigator closed his folder. "We'll be contacting the board members individually over the next few days," he said. Then he looked at the crowd. "If any residents have documentation related to HOA fines, contracts, or payments, please submit copies to our office." Luis Martinez raised his hand. "I've got plenty," he said. Several neighbors nodded in agreement. For the first time that night, Beverly looked genuinely overwhelmed. She had spent years controlling the narrative in that room, issuing fines, quoting rules, shutting down questions. Now she was the one being questioned, and she had no control over it. The investigator thanked the residents for their cooperation, then he and the officer quietly left the clubhouse. But the meeting wasn't over, not even close, because once the doors closed behind them, the room erupted again. Not with confusion this time, with determination. Daniel Prescott slowly stood up. "I think," he said carefully, "we need to discuss the leadership of this HOA." The room responded immediately. "Yes, absolutely, tonight." The HOA bylaws allowed homeowners to initiate a vote of removal for board members if a majority of residents supported it. Luis raised his voice over the crowd. "How many people here want new leadership?" Nearly every hand in the room went up. Daniel looked down at the table where Beverly was standing. "This community deserves transparency," he said quietly. Beverly didn't argue. She didn't speak at all. For the first time since the meeting began, she looked small. Within the next 30 minutes, the residents held an emergency vote. 3 board members, including Beverly Trout, were officially removed from their positions. 2 temporary replacements were selected from the residents to oversee HOA operations until a formal election could be organized. And just like that, the system Beverly had controlled for years was gone. The investigation lasted several months. County auditors reviewed HOA financial records going back 5 years. The results eventually became public. The pool renovation project had indeed been massively overpriced. Several contracts had been awarded to companies connected to Beverly's family, and thousands of dollars of HOA funds had been improperly directed through those companies. Legal proceedings followed. I won't get into every detail, but what mattered most to the neighborhood was simple. The money stopped disappearing, the fines stopped being weaponized, and the HOA finally started operating the way it was supposed to, for the residents, not against them. As for my mother, her roses stayed exactly where they were. The new HOA board officially dismissed the eviction notice within the first week. They also removed the violation from her record. One afternoon a few weeks later, I stopped by the house to check on her. She was out in the yard watering the roses. The same roses that started this entire chain of events. "They're growing nicely," she said, smiling. I looked at the bushes. "They're probably over 48 inches again." She chuckled. "Well," she said calmly, "I suppose someone will have to measure them." Then she went back to watering the garden, like nothing had ever happened. But the neighborhood had changed. People talked to each other more. Neighbors looked out for one another. And the HOA meetings, which once felt like formal lectures, became actual community discussions. Sometimes all it takes to fix a broken system is one person refusing to stay quiet. In this case, that person just so happened to be a 93-year-old woman with a garden full of roses. And honestly, those roses had never looked better.